So the next slide, figure we'd give Tom an opportunity to test me and explore what's this prohibition on minor non-structural modifications. And as I note on the bottom of the slide, the underlying rationale for the revenue ruling is that your trust is an investment trust for tax purposes. And under the Treasury regulations, the key to that is determining whether the trustee has the power to, quote unquote, vary the investment of the beneficiaries. So that's where this minor non-structural modification prohibition came from. Is it varying the investment? So, Tom?
Well, and so you get lots of issues that come up. You might end up if this is a newish building, these things aren't as complicated. But you might have, what would happen if the building was not sprinklered? Well, that wouldn't be a new building. What happens if there's a safety upgrade required by the government, and it's going to be relatively expensive? Maybe they have to upgrade the sprinkler system or something else. Would that be considered minor non-structural if it's required by law?
The revenue ruling has a specific carve out for changes required under applicable law. So, that I think is a great example. The laws change on you. You have to put in a sprinkler system. You have to make entrances ADA compliant, something along those lines. Because it's a law change that's requiring you to make that change, the revenue ruling carves those out of the analysis. So if there's a law that says you have to do this, you can do it without running afoul of the prohibition. So
what about,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
So, I think what we see is, we've already talked about, multifamily, you've raised office. And I think there's some judgment calls to make on, if you just use the words minor non-structural modification, what happens if I have to put in a wider door, in my loading bay? Is that a structural modification that causes me angst? There's a couple of others, just had a debate earlier in the week where the lender's requiring them to replace the roof instead of just a repair. So is that repair versus replacement a non-structural modification that varies the investment? So again, I think you need to go back to, are you varying the investment? The analysis we did on the roof issue was, well, it has a roof. And, does the roof materially change what they invested in? We debated, okay, you've increased the useful life of the roof, but have you increased the useful life of the entire building? Ultimately came down on the side that it was not varying the investment, but, there was a lot of analysis and thoughtfulness that went into reaching that conclusion.
Well, and what about something like if you had, some of the older buildings, or just you want to upgrade the standards today for air handling? I've been involved in a couple projects where the air handling needed to be upgraded, not just for COVID, but for lots of reasons. And they had some fairly expensive changes to make to the air handling. Now, that's not necessarily structural, but it took a fair amount of expense. Is that going to be considered to be?
Yeah, I think it's are you? I mean, you're not just sort of replacing the current ventilation. You're restructuring the whole thing. I think that's a tougher call to make. And
Okay.
Is that type of rehabilitation appropriate for a property within a DST? I would think that there's some degree of tax risk associated with that change. Again, there's not a whole lot of bright lines that you can draw here. But again, if your trustee has the power to do that, or if that's contemplated, at the time of the acquisition, you're implying that the trustee has the power to do that. You really want to, think twice on, are we varying the investment? I'd be concerned.
Okay. And obviously, if you don't do it, people who don't like air handling or worried about COVID or whatever might be harder to lease if you're doing an apartment building.
Right. And again, the typical questions we get in multifamily is, can I go and refresh the units? Can I replace and upgrade the refrigerators? Can I, redo the facilities in the laundry room, rehabilitate the common areas? Those are sort of non-structural modifications. Had a debate probably about 6 months ago where they were going to knock down the clubhouse and build a new clubhouse. And I had to draw the line and say, well, that's textbook structural modification right there. So, again, there's a lot of, well-seasoned tax advisors in this area. They have, varying degrees of risk that they'll take. Not a lot of bright lines that can be drawn, but, the stakes are that, if your plan, in a value-added situation is to, build a new wing, or build a new, an industrial property, build a new loading bay, to expand capacity, I think you have a lot of trouble with this prohibition.